The mansion stood like a frozen palace under the stormy sky, its golden chandeliers casting long, lonely shadows across the empty ballroom. 50 crystal glasses waited, untouched, their surfaces gleaming with the promise of a celebration that would never come. The air smelled of expensive perfume and betrayal. Richard Berg adjusted his cufflinks for the 10th time, his reflection in the grand mirror staring back at him. A man who had everything, yet tonight, he had no one. Not a single guest had arrived. The clock struck 9, its echo bouncing off the marble floors like a cruel laugh. This was supposed to be the night he proved to the world that power and money could buy anything, even loyalty. But the grand double doors remained shut, the driveway deserted, the silence deafening. His fingers tightened around the whiskey glass, the amber liquid trembling as his breath quickened. Where were they? The politicians who bowed at his feet, the CEOs who begged for his investments, the socialites who would kill for an invitation to one of his legendary parties? His phone buzzed. Another cancellation, another excuse, another lie. He hurled the glass against the wall, the shatter ringing through the hollow space like a gunshot. They all forgot who signs their paychecks, he snarled, his voice raw with fury. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't about forgotten RSVPs. This was about something darker, something he had spent years trying to bury. The staff moved like ghosts, avoiding his gaze as they cleared untouched appetizers from the tables. The orchestra he'd flown in from Vienna played on, their melancholic waltz twisting the knife deeper. Richard's empire was crumbling, and tonight the world had decided to let him fall alone. His eyes flickered to the portrait above the fireplace, his son Lucas smiling in his graduation gown, so full of life, so full of promise. A promise Richard had shattered with a single, ruthless decision. The memory clawed at him, but he shoved it away. He wouldn't think about that now, not when his kingdom was burning. Then, a knock. Soft, hesitant, almost invisible beneath the weight of his shame. The butler froze mid-step, exchanging a glance with Richard that spoke volumes. No one knocked at the Berg mansion unannounced. Not tonight, not ever. The butler moved toward the door, his polished shoes clicking against the marble like a countdown. Richard's pulse pounded in his ears. Who would dare? The heavy oak doors creaked open, revealing a figure no one expected. A man in tattered clothes, his face weathered by years on the streets, clutching a crumpled envelope in his trembling hands. His eyes locked onto Richard's, and in that moment, the billionaire felt something he hadn't in decades. Fear. "I was invited," the stranger said, his voice rough but steady. "By your son, sir." Richard's blood turned to ice. Lucas? That was impossible. Lucas was, "If you want to know what happens next, smash that like button and hit subscribe. This story is far from over, and you won't believe the truth behind that knock." Richard Berg had spent a lifetime building walls so high no one could scale them. Not his rivals, not his critics, and certainly not the thousands of employees he'd discarded like broken tools. But tonight, as the stranger stood in his foyer, the cracks in those walls began to show. The man's presence was a mirror reflecting back everything Richard had tried to outrun. The guilt, the regret, the hollow victory of a fortune built on ruined lives. The butler hesitated, his usual composure shattered by the absurdity of the scene. A homeless man at the door of the most exclusive address in the city, holding an invitation that couldn't possibly be real. Yet there it was, the embossed gold lettering of the Berg crest unmistakable, the ink slightly smudged, as if it had traveled through rain and time to reach this moment. Richard's jaw clenched as he stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble like a judge's gavel. "Get him out," he ordered, his voice a blade wrapped in velvet. But the butler didn't move. Instead, he held out the envelope, his hands shaking just enough to betray his fear. Richard snatched it, his fingers brushing against the stranger's calloused skin. The contact sent a jolt through him, as if the man's suffering had seeped into his own bones. The envelope was addressed to him in Lucas's handwriting, or at least what Lucas's handwriting might have looked like if he were still. No. He wouldn't think that word, wouldn't let himself believe it. The paper inside was yellowed with age, the edges frayed. A single sentence stared back at him, written in the hurried scrawl of someone who knew their time was running out. If you ever throw another party, Dad, let him in. He's the only one who ever really knew me. Richard's breath hitched. The room tilted. The stranger, this ghost from a past he'd locked away, didn't flinch under his glare. Instead, he lifted his chin, his eyes burning with a quiet defiance that made Richard's skin prickle. "You don't recognize me, do you?" the man said, his voice like gravel underfoot. "I'm James Holloway. I used to drive your son to school every morning. I was there the day you fired me, the day you told me my family's suffering was none of your concern." The words struck like a physical blow. Richard's mind flashed back to that day, the screaming match in his office, the way James had pleaded for just one more month, one more paycheck to cover his daughter's chemotherapy. And Richard, cold and untouchable, had looked him in the eye and said, "Business isn't personal, James, but your failure is." He'd watched the man's face crumple, watched him walk out with his head bowed, his pride shattered. And then he'd forgotten about him, just like he'd forgotten about so many others. But James hadn't forgotten. Oh no, he'd carried this moment with him through every sleepless night on park benches, every empty stomach, every time his daughter asked why her father couldn't fix things. And now, here he was, standing in the heart of Richard's empire, holding the one thing that could unravel it all. Richard's grip on the invitation tightened, the paper crumpling under his fingers. "Lucas is dead," he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He'd told himself that so many times it should have been true by now. But the way James's lips curled into a bitter smile told him everything he didn't want to know. "You really believe that, don't you?" James's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "You signed the papers, you buried the story, you even paid off the hospital to keep it quiet, but you never asked yourself why no one ever found his body." The air left Richard's lungs. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the weight of his choices pressed down on him. He'd been told there was nothing left to recover after the accident, that the car had gone up in flames, that Lucas was gone. But what if that had been another lie? What if his son had survived, only to disappear into the shadows, watching, waiting, plotting? His mind raced, piecing together the clues he'd ignored. The withdrawn funds from Lucas's trust, the cryptic emails from unknown addresses, the way his son's best friend had refused to meet his eyes at the memorial. Had they all known? Had his own son orchestrated this moment from the darkness, pulling the strings like a puppeteer? Richard's gaze flicked to the portrait above the fireplace. Lucas, forever frozen at 22, his smile hauntingly alive. Had he been alive this whole time? Had he been suffering alone, while Richard drowned his grief in board meetings and champagne? The thought was a poison, seeping into his veins. He'd built his life on control, on the unshakable belief that he was untouchable. But tonight, that control was slipping through his fingers like sand. James took a step closer, and Richard instinctively recoiled. "He made me promise," James said, his voice breaking. "He said you'd never listen to him again. But you might listen to me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, a Polaroid faded at the edges. A younger Lucas, his arm slung around James's daughter, both of them grinning at the camera, their faces alight with a joy Richard hadn't seen in his son since he was a child. "He loved her like a sister," James said. "He used to sneak her into this house when you were away, let her swim in your pool, eat at your table. He told her you weren't a monster, that you just didn't know how to be anything else." The photo trembled in Richard's hand. He could almost hear Lucas's laughter echoing through the halls, could almost see the way his son's eyes had lit up when he talked about his dreams. Dreams Richard had dismissed as naive, dreams he'd buried under the weight of his expectations. And then, like a gut punch, James delivered the final blow. "She died last winter. Leukemia. The same disease you could have helped cure if you'd given me that extra month, if you'd cared enough to look at me like a human being instead of a line item on your balance sheet." The words hung between them, heavy and irreversible. Richard's knees nearly buckled. He'd killed this man's daughter, not with his hands but with his indifference. And now James was here to collect a debt Richard didn't even know he owed. But why tonight? Why now? James's expression darkened. Lucas said you'd understand when the time was right, that you'd finally see what you'd become. He gestured to the empty ballroom, the untouched feast, the orchestra playing to an audience of ghosts. Looks like he was right. Richard's eyes burned. He wanted to scream, to deny it all, to order his security team to drag this man out and pretend this conversation had never happened. But something held him back. A flicker of hope. A desperate, foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to fix what he'd broken. But before he could speak, before he could demand answers or beg for forgiveness, James reached into his coat again. This time, he pulled out a small silver key. "He left this for you," he said, pressing it into Richard's palm. "He said you'd know what it opens." Richard stared at the key, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He did know. Of course he knew. It was the key to the old boathouse, the place Lucas had loved more than anything, the place Richard had boarded up after the accident, unable to bear the memories it held. And then, without another word, James turned and walked out, leaving Richard alone with the ghosts of his past and the terrifying possibility that his son was still out there, waiting, watching, judging. Richard's fingers closed around the silver key, its cold metal biting into his palm like a warning. The boathouse. He hadn't set foot in that place since the night of the accident, the night the police had knocked on his door with their hollow apologies and their empty promises of answers. The night he'd decided it was easier to believe Lucas was gone than to face the truth, that his own ruthlessness might have driven his son away. The key felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of every cruel word, every broken promise, every moment he'd chosen profit over his own flesh and blood. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing as he stared at the empty doorway where James had stood just seconds before. The man was gone, vanished into the storm outside, leaving only the echo of his words and the photograph still clutched in Richard's trembling hand. He should have chased after him, should have demanded answers, torn the truth from him like a band-aid from a wound, but his body refused to move, rooted in place by a fear he hadn't felt in decades. The fear of what he might find. The orchestra's music had faded to a whisper, the last few notes dying in the air like a sigh. The staff had melted into the shadows, sensing the shift in the room, the way the air had grown thick with something darker than grief. Richard's gaze darted to the grand staircase, to the hallway that led to his study, to the front doors still ajar, letting in the cold night wind. He could call his driver, order him to follow James, to drag him back by force if necessary. But what would he say? Tell me where my son is? Tell me I didn't destroy everything that mattered? His free hand fisted at his side. He was Richard Berg, a man who bent the world to his will. Yet here he was, paralyzed by a key and a photograph, by the ghost of his son's laughter still lingering in the corners of his mind. Then, like a spark in the dark, a memory surfaced. Lucas at 12, grinning as he unlocked the boathouse door, his eyes bright with mischief. "This is our place, Dad," he'd said, tugging Richard's sleeve. "No suits, no meetings, just us." Richard had indulged him once. He'd sat on the creaky wooden dock watching Lucas row out onto the lake, his small frame determined despite the waves. He'd been so proud, so full of life. And Richard had let that life slip through his fingers, one board meeting at a time. The key burned in his hand. He had to know. He didn't bother with a coat. The cold didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the answer waiting for him at the end of the winding path to the lake. His shoes sank into the damp earth as he stepped outside, the storm lashing at him as if the sky itself was angry. The path was overgrown, the trees clawing at his arms like skeletal fingers. He barely noticed. His focus was on the boathouse, its silhouette dark against the water, the lock rusted but intact. His hands shook as he slid the key into the padlock. It clicked open with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silence. The door groaned as he pushed it open, the hinges protesting after years of disuse. The scent hit him first, damp wood and old memories, the faintest trace of Lucas's cologne still clinging to the air. His breath caught. The boathouse wasn't empty. A single lantern flickered in the corner, casting long shadows over the walls. And there, in the center of the room, was a table. Not just any table, Lucas's table, the one he'd built with his own hands the summer he turned 16. On it sat a leather-bound journal, its pages worn from use. Beside it, a small framed photo. Lucas, older now, his face thinner, his eyes tired but alive. Alive. Richard's knees nearly gave out. He's alive. But the journal wasn't just a diary. It was a ledger. Page after page of names, dates, transactions, all tied to Berg Industries. And scrawled in the margins, in Lucas's unmistakable handwriting, were notes. Father's latest layoffs. 2,000 families ruined. James Holloway's daughter, Emily, denied treatment. Mom's charity funds diverted to offshore accounts. The words blurred as Richard's eyes filled with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years. Lucas had been watching, documenting, judging. And then, on the final page, a letter, dated just 3 days ago. Dad, if you're reading this, you finally came home. Richard's vision swam. He sank into the chair behind the table, his legs no longer able to support him. The letter was addressed to him, but the words felt like a knife twisting in his chest. I tried to tell you 100 times, tried to show you the man you used to be before the money, before the power. But you wouldn't listen, so I left. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't watch you become a monster. I couldn't be part of it anymore. I found people who needed help, people you threw away, and I did what I could. But I'm sick now. The accident left scars deeper than you know, and I'm running out of time. Richard's hands flew to his mouth, stifling a sob. Sick? What did that mean? Was he? I didn't want you to find out like this, but James was right. You'd never listen to me. Maybe you'll listen to them. Them? Richard flipped the page, his heart pounding. A list of names stared back at him. Former employees, families he'd ruined, and at the bottom a single address, a hospital, St. Mary's Palliative Care, Geneva. His son was dying. The realization hit him like a freight train. All this time, Lucas had been out there, suffering, while Richard played the grieving father, the untouchable titan of industry. He'd been so blind, so stupid. A noise outside snapped him back to the present. Footsteps. Someone was coming. He turned just as the boathouse door creaked open, the lantern's light casting a shadow across the floor. His security chief, Marcus, stood there, his face unreadable. Sir, he said, his voice careful. We've been looking for you. There's... Richard didn't let him finish. Get the jet ready, he barked, shoving the journal into his coat. Now, and call the hospital. Tell them I'm coming. Marcus hesitated. Sir, the storm... Now! Richard's voice was a thunderclap, raw with a desperation he'd never shown before. Marcus nodded once and disappeared into the night. Richard took one last look around the boathouse, his gaze lingering on the photo of Lucas. His son had been here. He'd been waiting, and Richard had almost missed his chance. But as he turned to leave, his eye caught something else, a small wooden box tucked beneath the table. He knelt, his hands brushing away the dust. Inside, a single medal glinted in the lantern light, the medal Lucas had won in his last regatta, the one Richard had missed because of a critical business trip. Taped to it was another note. Forgiveness isn't yours to ask for, Dad. It's yours to earn. The words cut deep. He pocketed the medal, his mind already racing. He'd spend every cent, every ounce of his influence to make this right. But first, he had to get to Geneva. He had to see his son. Had to tell him. A sharp crack echoed through the boathouse. Richard froze. That wasn't thunder. Marcus burst back in, his face pale. Sir, we've got a problem. The police are here. They're saying... A shadow moved behind him. A figure stepped into the light. a gun glinting in his hand. Richard's blood ran cold. "Hello, Richard," the man said, his voice dripping with venom. "Did you really think you could just walk away?" The boathouse door slammed shut behind them. "What do you think happens next? Who is the man with the gun, and what does he want with Richard? Drop your theory in the comments." The gun barrel gleamed under the flickering lantern light, its presence turning the boathouse into a cage. Richard's breath hitched, his pulse roaring in his ears as he locked eyes with the intruder, a man he hadn't seen in over a decade, but whose face had haunted his nightmares ever since. Daniel Mercer, the lead investigator from the accident that had supposedly taken Lucas's life, the man Richard had paid to bury the truth, the man who was now pointing a weapon straight at his chest, his knuckles white with rage. "You remember me, don't you?" Daniel's voice was a rasp, raw with years of suppressed fury. "Or did you forget, just like you forgot about the boy you left to die in that wreckage?" Richard's mind raced. He'd assumed the accident report was sealed, the witnesses silenced, the evidence gone. But the way Daniel's finger twitched on the trigger told him everything he needed to know. Someone had talked, and if Daniel was here, that meant the lies Richard had built his sanity on were crumbling. "I don't know what you think you know," Richard started, but Daniel cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Oh, I know, Richard. I know everything." He stepped closer, the gun never wavering. "I know you paid me to falsify the report. I know you made sure no one looked too hard at the brakes on that car. And I know your son didn't die that night. He ran, because even he couldn't stomach what you'd become." The words struck like a physical blow. Richard's knees nearly buckled. Lucas didn't die. The thought was both a relief and a torment. If his son was alive, then every excuse Richard had clutched to, every late-night whiskey, every empty apology, every hollow eulogy, had been a lie. And worse, Lucas had known. He'd let his father believe he was dead rather than face him. Daniel's lip curled. "You look surprised. Did you really think he'd come crawling back after what you did? After you let him take the fall for your corruption?" Richard's throat tightened. "What fall?" "The embezzlement." Daniel's voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "The missing funds from your own charity. The ones Lucas was framed for. The ones you stole to cover your bad investments. He found out. Confronted you. And you—" the gun trembled. "You let him walk into that car knowing the brakes were faulty. You wanted him gone." A wave of nausea crashed over Richard. No, that wasn't true. He'd made mistakes, terrible ones, but he'd never— Liar. Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. "I have the records, Richard, the mechanic's confession, the transfer logs. Lucas didn't just run, he planned this. Every step, the journal, the key, the letter. It was all to lead you here. To this." He gestured to the boathouse, to the storm raging outside, to the truth Richard could no longer outrun. Richard's gaze flicked to the journal on the table, its pages filled with Lucas's handwriting. Proof. Proof of betrayals he didn't even remember committing. Proof that his son had spent years orchestrating this moment. "Why?" he choked out. "Why now?" Daniel's smile was a blade. "Because he's dying, and he wanted you to see the man you are before he's gone." The words hit like a sledgehammer. Richard's vision blurred. All this time, Lucas had been out there suffering, while Richard played the grieving tycoon. And now his son was on his deathbed, and the last thing he'd ever know was that his father was a monster. Unless Richard could change that. His eyes darted to the door, to Marcus's motionless form just beyond it. If he could get to the jet, if he could reach Geneva before— "Don't even think about it." Daniel followed his gaze, his voice deadly calm. "You're not leaving this room until I say so, and I'm not done with you yet." Richard's mind raced. He needed time, needed a way out. "What do you want?" he demanded, injecting every ounce of command he had left into his voice. "Money? Power? Name your price." Daniel laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "You still think this is a negotiation?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, tossing it onto the table. "That's a confession, signed by you. Admitting to fraud, embezzlement, murder. His eyes burned with triumph. Lucas wanted you to sign it, wanted you to own what you've done before you see him. A final test, he called it. If he signs, he's still my father. If he doesn't, well, Daniel's smile vanished. He didn't say what happens if you don't, but I have a feeling it involves a bullet. Richard stared at the paper, his stomach twisting. This was his son's last move, a gamble to see if the man who'd raised him was still in there, buried under decades of greed. If he signed, he'd lose everything. His empire, his freedom, his name. But if he didn't, he'd lose Lucas. Forever. The storm howled outside, the wind rattling the boathouse walls like a warning. Somewhere out there, his son was waiting, dying. And Richard was trapped between the man he'd become and the father he'd failed to be. His hand hovered over the pen. Richard's fingers hovered over the pen, the weight of the confession pressing down on him like a tombstone. The ink shimmered under the lantern's dim glow, mocking him. One signature, and his empire would crumble. One signature, and the world would know the truth, that Richard Berg wasn't just a ruthless businessman, but a criminal, a fraud, a man who had sacrificed his own son for power. But if he didn't sign, he'd lose Lucas forever. The pen trembled in his grip. He could almost hear his son's voice echoing through the boathouse like a ghost. Forgiveness isn't yours to ask for, Dad. It's yours to earn. The words cut deeper than any bullet could. He'd spent a lifetime believing he was untouchable, that money and influence could erase any sin. But not this one, not the betrayal of his own blood. Daniel's finger twitched on the trigger. Tick-tock, Richard. Your son's running out of time, and so are you. A cold sweat broke out on Richard's neck. He thought of the hospital in Geneva, of Lucas lying in a bed, his body failing, his heart heavy with the weight of his father's sins. He thought of the journal, of the names Lucas had meticulously documented, the families ruined, the lives shattered, all in the name of Berg Industries, all in his name. And then he thought of the medal in his pocket, the one Lucas had won the day Richard had chosen a board meeting over his son's triumph, the day everything had begun to unravel. His breath came in ragged gasps. He wasn't just signing a confession, he was signing his own eulogy. The world would remember him as a villain, a man who had fallen from grace in the most spectacular way possible. But maybe, just maybe, Lucas would remember him as something else. As a father who had finally chosen him over everything else. With a shuddering exhale, Richard scrawled his name across the bottom of the page. The ink bled into the paper like a wound. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he snatched the document, scanning it before a slow, bitter smile spread across his face. Good, now we're done here. He lowered the gun just enough to gesture toward the door. Your jet's waiting, but remember, if you try to run, if you so much as think about backing out of this, the confession goes public. And I will find you. Richard didn't waste a second. He lunged for the door, his pulse roaring in his ears as he burst into the storm. The rain lashed at his skin, the wind howling like a chorus of the damned, but he didn't care. He had to get to Geneva. He had to see his son. Marcus was already behind the wheel of the car, his face pale. The jet's fueled, sir, but the storm— Drive, Richard barked, slamming the door. The tires screeched as they peeled away from the boathouse, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a blade. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from his pilot. We're cleared for takeoff. Barely. But we have to leave now. Richard's hands clenched in his lap. He was risking everything. His company, his fortune, his freedom. But for the first time in years, he felt something he'd thought was long dead. Hope. The private airstrip was a blur of activity as the car skidded to a halt. Richard barely waited for the door to open before he was sprinting across the tarmac, the rain soaking him to the bone. The jet's engines roared to life as he bounded up the stairs, his heart pounding in time with the thunder. Geneva, he ordered the crew. Now. The plane lurched forward, the storm tossing it like a toy as it fought for altitude. Richard collapsed into a seat, his body shaking with adrenaline and terror. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying over the screen as he dialed the hospital. "This is Richard Berg," he said the moment someone answered. "I need to speak to Dr. Laurent." "My son, Lucas Berg. He's there. I'm on my way." There was a pause. Then a voice, cautious but urgent. "Mr. Berg, you need to hurry. His condition—" "I know," Richard snapped. "Just keep him alive, please." He ended the call and leaned back, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The confession burned in his coat pocket. A ticking time bomb. But none of that mattered. Not the scandal, not the prison sentence, not the fall from grace. All that mattered was getting to Lucas in time. The plane broke through the storm clouds, the sky opening up above them like a promise. Richard closed his eyes, his mind racing with everything he needed to say. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I choose you." But as the jet leveled out, his phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. His blood ran cold as he read it. "Too late, Dad. I'm already gone." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. No, it couldn't be. The phone slipped from his fingers as the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Sir, we've got a problem. Air traffic control just received an anonymous tip. They're ordering us to turn back." Richard's head snapped up. "What? Why?" "They won't say, but they're threatening to scramble fighters if we don't comply." His stomach twisted. Daniel, it had to be. A final test. A final cruelty. The plane banked sharply, turning away from Geneva. Away from Lucas. Richard's vision blurred with tears he hadn't shed in decades. He'd signed the confession. He'd chosen his son. And now, the world was conspiring to keep them apart. Or was it? His eyes fell on the emergency exit. One pull of the lever, and he'd be free. Free to jump, free to find another way to Geneva, free to defy the system one last time. But if he did, he'd never make it. The storm, the altitude, the cold, it would kill him before he ever reached the ground. Unless... His gaze locked onto the parachute stowed beneath his seat. Richard's hands shook as he unbuckled his seatbelt, his mind racing faster than the jet's engines. The parachute was heavy in his grip, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like the storm outside. One wrong move, and he'd plunge into the abyss. But if he stayed on this plane, if he let them turn back, he'd lose Lucas forever, and this time there would be no second chances. The intercom crackled again. "Final warning, Mr. Berg, we have to turn back." Richard didn't hesitate. With a roar of defiance, he wrenched open the emergency exit. The wind howled, tearing at his clothes, his skin, his very soul as he stood on the precipice. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. One last moment of fear, of doubt. Then he leapt. The free fall was terrifying. The storm swallowed him whole, the rain and wind whipping him like a rag doll. His heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled for the parachute ripcord. 1, 2, 3. The chute deployed with a violent jerk, snapping him upright as the world spun beneath him. He was alive. Barely. The lights of Geneva flickered in the distance, a beacon of hope through the storm. He steered toward them, his body numb with cold, his mind focused on a single desperate thought. "I'm coming, Lucas." The landing was brutal. He hit the ground hard, rolling across the soggy earth before coming to a stop in a field just outside the city. Pain shot through his ribs, his legs, but he forced himself up. He had to keep moving. The hospital loomed ahead, its bright lights a stark contrast to the darkness in his heart. He stumbled through the doors, his clothes torn, his face streaked with blood and rain. The nurses gasped, but he didn't care. "Lucas Berg," he rasped. "Where is he?" A doctor rushed forward, her eyes wide with recognition and pity. "You're too late," she said softly. "He passed just minutes ago." The world stopped. Richard's knees buckled. No, this couldn't be happening. He'd signed the confession. He'd jumped from a plane. He'd chosen his son, and it still wasn't enough. But then, from the end of the hallway, a weak voice called out, "Dad!" Richard's head snapped up. Lucas was there, pale, frail, hooked up to machines, but alive. His lips curved into a faint smile as Richard stumbled toward him, his vision blurred with tears. "You came," Lucas whispered. Richard collapsed at his son's bedside, his hands gripping Lucas's with a desperation born of years of regret. "I came," he choked out. "I'm so sorry. For everything." Lucas's fingers tightened around his. "I know." Those two words shattered the last of Richard's defenses. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with sobs he'd suppressed for too long. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice raw. "I chose the wrong things. I lost you. I lost me." Lucas's breath was shallow, his voice barely audible. "You found me, that's all that matters." Richard looked up, his heart breaking and healing all at once. His son was here, alive. And for the first time in years he felt something he'd thought was gone forever. Redemption. But their time was running out. Lucas's eyes fluttered closed, his grip weakening. "The confession," he murmured. "It's not just for you. It's for all of them. The families you hurt, the people you forgot." Richard nodded, his throat tight. "I'll make it right. I promise." Lucas smiled, his face peaceful. "I know you will." And then, with one final breath, he was gone. The monitors flatlined, the room filled with the sound of Richard's shattered sobs. He'd made it. He'd chosen his son. But the cost was unbearable. 1 year later, the courthouse was packed as Richard Berg stood before the judge, his hands cuffed, his head held high. The confession had been made public. His empire was in ruins. His name was mud. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, former employees, families he'd wronged, even James Holloway sitting in the front row, he felt something he never had in all his years of power. Peace. The judge's gavel fell. "Richard Berg, for your crimes, you are hereby sentenced to 20 years in prison." He didn't fight it, didn't flinch, because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. As the bailiffs led him away, he caught James's eye. The man nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, a forgiveness, and in that moment Richard knew he'd finally earned it. If this story broke your heart, smash that like button and subscribe for more emotional high-stakes dramas. What would you have done in Richard's place? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.